This photograph was taken in 1874 at the Pennhurst State Lunatic Asylum in rural Pennsylvania. The girl you're seeing is Eleanor Hayes, only 10 years old. But look carefully at this image. The hollow eyes, the unnaturally stiff posture, the faint, almost imperceptible smile. People who've seen this photograph in person often say it's like looking into the eyes of something that isn't entirely human. Eleanor Hayes became one of the most disturbing, well-documented, and unexplained psychiatric cases of the late 19th century. What happened to her remains a mystery that defies both medical science and theology. Her story, recorded in forgotten hospital archives and the private journals of the doctors who treated her, has haunted generations of researchers. To understand the case of Eleanor Hayes, we must go back to the America of 1874, an age of scientific optimism, spiritualism, and superstition in equal measure. The Civil War had ended less than a decade earlier, but the scars remained everywhere in the towns, in the families, and in the hearts of those who had seen too much death. Pennsylvania, with its rapidly industrializing cities and coal-mining towns, was a landscape caught between progress and shadow. It was a world where steam engines and seances coexisted, where belief in ghosts was as common as belief in medicine. Eleanor Hayes was born on the 22nd of November, 1864, in the small town of Easton, Pennsylvania. Her parents, Samuel and Clara Hayes, were ordinary working-class people. Samuel was a machinist at a locomotive foundry. Clara worked part-time as a seamstress for a local tailor. They were strict Methodists, honest and hard-working, living in a modest 2-story brick house on Pine Street. By all accounts, Eleanor's early years were unremarkable. She was a cheerful, imaginative child, fond of drawing, singing hymns with her mother, and following her father to the foundry whenever she was allowed. Teachers described her as bright, polite, and curious, though slightly withdrawn. Everything changed in the summer of 1872 when Eleanor was 7. On the morning of July 19th, Clara found her daughter sitting upright in bed, wide awake but strangely motionless. When asked why she hadn't come down for breakfast, Eleanor replied in a tone of quiet confusion, "Because the house isn't real anymore. You'll see soon." Clara dismissed it as a childish dream. But over the next days, Eleanor began speaking of things she couldn't possibly know, accidents that hadn't yet happened, deaths no one had yet heard about. On July 21st, she told her father not to take his usual route to work, saying that something bad would happen near the bridge. Samuel laughed it off. That very afternoon, a section of the Easton Iron Bridge collapsed under the weight of a passing cart. 2 men were killed. Samuel would have been among them had he not been delayed that morning. When word reached the Hayes family, Clara fainted. Samuel could not stop trembling for the rest of the night. At first, they thought it was coincidence, until it kept happening. Over the following weeks, Eleanor began waking from nightmares in which she claimed to see things that were not meant to be seen. She described scenes of fires, drownings, and strange mechanical disasters with unnerving precision. And within days, each event would happen not only in Easton, but in neighboring towns. When her parents asked how she could possibly know these things, Eleanor would only say, "They show me when I'm asleep, the ones that live between the ticking seconds." By the winter of 1873, Eleanor's condition, or gift, had turned darker. She no longer seemed like the same child. She spoke less, stared more, and began sketching obsessively in her notebooks. The drawings were unlike anything her family had ever seen. They showed complex machines that didn't exist yet, metal structures with gears and cables, strange towers filled with light, enormous vessels moving through the air. Some of her designs bore eerie resemblance to inventions that wouldn't appear until decades later. But among the drawings of machines were far more disturbing images: skeletal figures standing in circles of fire, twisted human forms with missing faces, and one recurring symbol, a spiral made of interlocking hands. She called it the sign of the Watchers. At night, Eleanor began talking in her sleep. Her mother would wake to the sound of her daughter whispering in languages she couldn't recognize. Sometimes the whispers were accompanied by faint knocks on the walls, always in groups of 3. The family's pastor, Reverend Thomas Whitaker, was summoned to the house. He described Eleanor's presence as profoundly unsettling. During their first meeting, she looked at him and said softly, "You still hide the key from the church, don't you, Reverend?" Whitaker froze. No one knew that he secretly kept a small silver key in the lining of his Bible, a relic from his missionary days in Haiti. When he asked how she could know this, Eleanor smiled faintly and said, "They showed me. They like the sound it makes when you pray." After that encounter, the Reverend urged the Hayes family to consult a physician, convinced the child's behavior was not of spiritual origin but medical necessity. The doctor they turned to was Dr. Arthur Winslow, a respected physician who had recently returned from Europe after studying psychiatry in Paris. He was a man of reason, skeptical of superstition, but deeply curious. When he met Eleanor in January 1874, he expected a case of epilepsy or somnambulism. Instead, he encountered something that shook his confidence in science. During his examinations, Eleanor displayed knowledge far beyond her education. She recited entire paragraphs from Pliny the Elder's Natural History in flawless Latin, a language she had never studied. She could identify chemical compounds by smell alone, and once, without prompting, correctly describe the mechanism of a camera obscura. But what unsettled Dr. Winslow most were the dreams she wrote down for him. Each morning, he found detailed accounts of disasters that had not yet occurred: a fire in a coal mine, the explosion of a boiler in a textile mill, and even the death of one of his own patients, which came true 3 days later. He wrote in his journal, "This child's mind functions as though time itself were an open book to her. Yet she reads, not with curiosity, but with dread. There is intelligence behind her eyes, something ancient, watching through her." In February 1874, Winslow arranged for Eleanor to be photographed, hoping to document her case for medical study. The image that survives today, the haunting portrait taken at Penhurst, was the result. During the session, the photographer, Edmund Lowell, reported that the room's temperature dropped so suddenly that his glass plates frosted over. When the photo was developed, faint, almost human shapes appeared behind Eleanor's chair, blurred forms that resembled faces. Dr. Winslow dismissed them as light artifacts. Others were not so sure. After the photograph, Eleanor's condition deteriorated rapidly. She began suffering long episodes of paralysis, during which she remained conscious but unable to move or speak. Her eyes stayed open, fixed on a point only she could see. When she emerged from these states, she often wrote furiously for hours, filling page after page with symbols and diagrams. Winslow preserved many of these writings, now housed in the Pennsylvania Historical Medical Archive. Linguists have identified fragments of at least 6 languages: Latin, Greek, Hebrew, and others that remain undeciphered. Then came the voices. Nurses in the Hayes household swore they heard whispering when they passed Eleanor's room at night. The whispers didn't sound like a child's voice, but like many voices speaking in unison, overlapping, weaving together into incomprehensible words. Once, Samuel burst into the room thinking an intruder had entered, only to find Eleanor alone, sitting cross-legged on the floor, smiling. She looked up and said calmly, "They've learned to speak through me now. Isn't it beautiful?" That same night, the family's oil lamps flickered and went out, even though the wicks were fresh. By early March, Dr. Winslow insisted that Eleanor be moved to a controlled environment. Reluctantly, her parents agreed to her transfer to Penhurst State Asylum, a sprawling Gothic facility located several miles outside Philadelphia. The asylum had gained a reputation for modern medical care, though its methods were primitive by today's standards: isolation, restraint, and cold baths among them. When Eleanor arrived on March 9, 1874, witnesses noted that she seemed unusually calm, even pleased. Upon seeing the building's towering facade, she reportedly whispered, "I've been here before, not as me, but as them." She was placed under the care of Dr. Nathaniel Greaves, the asylum superintendent. Greaves was a staunch materialist who dismissed Winslow's claims as overactive imagination. But that skepticism would not last long. Within 2 weeks of Eleanor's arrival, strange phenomena began to plague the asylum. Electrical equipment failed without explanation. Clocks stopped at precisely 3:17 a.m. each night, then resumed at dawn. Patients reported seeing a shadowed girl wandering the halls, her bare feet leaving no sound. Nurses began refusing to enter Eleanor's room alone. They claimed she spoke to someone unseen, not in English, but in a rhythmic, melodic tone. Sometimes she answered questions that hadn't been asked aloud. Dr. Greaves, determined to disprove superstition, ordered a controlled observation. 3 nurses, a stenographer, and himself remained with Eleanor through the night. For hours, nothing happened. Then, just after midnight, the air grew icy. The oil lamps dimmed. Eleanor opened her eyes and began speaking in a voice that the stenographer later described as layered, as though several people were speaking through her mouth. She said, "The circle closes tonight. Time eats itself. You shouldn't have brought me here." Moments later, every clock in the ward stopped again, all hands frozen at 3:17. The following morning, one of the nurses resigned and left the asylum, never to return. Dr. Winslow, upon hearing of these events, rushed from Easton to Penhurst to resume observation. What he found in Eleanor's cell defied belief. She had drawn enormous spirals across the walls using charcoal, repeating that same pattern of interlocking hands. The drawings extended across the ceiling, forming perfect geometric symmetry. Winslow noted that Eleanor had not been given any climbing tools and was too small to have reached the upper corners of the room. When he asked how she had done it, she replied, "They helped, they want you to see." Her voice, he wrote, was a mixture of calmness and something immeasurably old. Winslow requested that the child be moved to a high-security ward, but before arrangements could be made, a final and catastrophic incident occurred. On the night of April 3rd, 1874, a violent thunderstorm swept across Pennsylvania. The asylum's power, still primitive and dependent on gaslight, failed. In the confusion, staff rushed to secure patients. When the lights returned, Eleanor Hayes was gone. Her cell door remained locked from the outside. The only clue was a single phrase written on the floor in her handwriting. "They opened the sky." A full search of the building and surrounding grounds yielded nothing. No footprints in the mud, no torn clothing, no trace of her body. 3 days later, the asylum's night watchman reported seeing a figure standing on the North Hill, behind the building, a small girl in a white gown, staring at the sky during a lightning storm. When he called out to her, the figure slowly turned, and in the flash of lightning he saw that her eyes reflected no light at all, completely black. When he reached the spot, the girl was gone. Only a faint spiral, carved into the stone with impossible precision, remained. Dr. Winslow spent the remainder of his life trying to understand what had happened. He published a short paper on precognitive hallucinations in children, but omitted Eleanor's name. His private journals, discovered decades later, reveal the truth he never dared publish. In one entry dated September 1876, he wrote, "I believe now that the child did not see the future, she remembered it. The past, the present, and the yet to come are all the same place for whatever spoke through her." No remains of Eleanor Hayes were ever found. Her parents died within 5 years of her disappearance, both said to have suffered recurring dreams of their daughter standing in the snow, eyes black as ink, whispering the words, "The hands are closing." The photograph taken of Eleanor in 1874 still exists, though it's kept locked in a restricted section of the Pennsylvania Historical Society archives. Archivists who've handled it claim the image seems to subtly change over time. In early prints, Eleanor is alone. In later copies, faint shapes appear behind her, more defined with each decade. Researchers call it an optical illusion. Others call it something else. Whatever the truth is, the case of Eleanor Hayes remains one of the most chilling unsolved mysteries of 19th century psychiatry, a story that continues to blur the line between science, faith, and the unexplainable. And perhaps, somewhere, she still dreams. If you found this story fascinating, please like this video, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications, because there are more forgotten cases, more chilling mysteries from history's darkest corners waiting to be told.